Welcome to the deep dive. Today we're looking at something pretty huge. How exactly did the United States become the global power it is today?
It's a massive topic.
Right. We'll be digging into a lot of analysis, looking at those key moments, the big strategic shifts that took America from, a brand new nation all the way to the post-Cold War world.
Exactly. And we're aiming to give you a clearer picture, moving beyond just the simple stories.
Looking for those surprising turns, maybe the hidden strategies that really shaped America's place in the world.
Yeah, the underlying currents.
And for you listening, if you want to get your head around this complex history without drowning in detail, this should give you those aha moments.
Hopefully making some connections clear.
We're starting right back at the beginning. 1783. American independence is recognized. But it's a young republic, quite limited, really.
Oh, definitely limited. You've got the British still firmly in Canada up north. And Spanish influence is huge down south and west. They were really hemmed in.
And it wasn't just lines on a map, was it? I mean, the War of 1812.
Well, yeah. The fact that Washington, D.C. itself was captured and burned,
Right.
that really drives home how vulnerable the country was back then. A fragile state, absolutely.
It really highlights that early precariousness.
But things started to shift. Let's jump forward a bit, maybe to 1823, the Monroe Doctrine.
Okay, the Monroe Doctrine. This feels like a big one.
It was a pivotal moment, yeah.
So unpack that for us. What was the core message?
Essentially, the U.S. declared that the Western Hemisphere was off limits to future European colonization or political meddling.
Basically telling Europe, stay out of our backyard.
Pretty much. No new colonies, no interference. It was a remarkably assertive stance for such a relatively young nation.
It really was.
Yeah.
And, while it sounds like it's about keeping Europe out, doesn't it also kind of clear the way for the U.S. itself to become dominant in the hemisphere later on?
That's a really sharp insight. Yes, implicitly it did. It set a precedent for the U.S. acting as the regional power. It laid groundwork.
And while they're making this big declaration?
They're also expanding massively on the continent itself.
Right. This period sees incredible territorial growth.
Oh, absolutely. You get Kentucky, Tennessee, Ohio joining early on. Then the huge Louisiana Purchase from Napoleon, talk about opportunistic expansion.
Double the country overnight, practically.
Almost. And it keeps going. Indiana, Illinois, Missouri, Arkansas. Then Florida gets purchased from Spain.
It's relentless. Just state after state being added.
A massive amount of land acquired relatively quickly.
And this whole westward push, it wasn't exactly peaceful, was it?
No, absolutely not. It fundamentally involved the displacement, often violently, of Native American populations. That's a crucial and deeply troubling part of this expansion story.
Can't overlook that. And the expansion didn't stop there. Mexico became the next target.
Correct. The annexation of Texas in 1845 was a major flashpoint.
Leading to war.
To the Mexican-American War, yeah, ending in 1848. And the outcome. The U.S. acquired California, Arizona, New Mexico, Nevada, Utah, parts of Colorado.
Just enormous territories.
Fast. So within decades, the U.S. had cemented this dominant footprint across a huge chunk of North America.
So we've got this continental giant.
Yeah.
How does it start projecting power beyond North America? When does it start looking overseas?
That really starts picking up steam towards the end of the 19th century. The Spanish-American War is the key moment there.
Okay.
That's the first major overseas military intervention. The U.S. acquires Puerto Rico, Guam, and the Philippines.
The Philippines conquest wasn't straightforward, though, right?
Not at all. It involved a really difficult, bloody counterinsurgency campaign.
Yeah.
It showed the challenges of projecting power so far away.
And what about Cuba and all this?
Cuba was granted independence technically, but there was a big catch. The Platt Amendment.
Yes, allowing the U.S. to intervene.
Exactly. Allowed the U.S. to step in to protect its interests. And crucially, that's when the Guantanamo Bay naval base was established. Still there today.
A lasting legacy. So the U.S. is now an overseas power, but the focus seems to be more Pacific, Asia-Pacific, rather than Europe initially.
That's right. Around the turn of the 20th century, the general policy was keep some distance from messy European politics, but get actively involved in the Asia-Pacific. Think about the open door policy regarding China.
Trying to ensure trade access for everyone, including the U.S.
Precisely. And it's around this time, maybe starting around 1905 after the Russo-Japanese War, that Japan starts to emerge as a significant potential rival in that region.
Okay, so the U.S. is expanding, becoming a global player. But it
Yeah.
doesn't sound like this was all part of some master plan hatched back in 1783.
That's a really important point. There wasn't really a conscious long-term global strategy from the outset.
Interesting.
A lot of the diplomatic and political leaders came from business, from law,
Hmm.
not necessarily deep geopolitical thinkers planning centuries ahead.
So maybe that lack of a rigid plan actually helped, allowed for more flexibility, more opportunism,
You could definitely argue that. It allowed for pragmatic moves, seizing opportunities as they arose.
which leads to maybe the biggest question. How does this nation, without that initial grand strategy, end up as the dominant global power after World War II? That seems like a huge jump.
It was a massive leap, and in many ways unexpected. It was less about deliberate strategy and more about, well, circumstances.
Like what?
Primarily, its immense industrial and economic power, its financial capacity, plus a large population. And crucially,
It's the location.
its territory was safe. Unlike Europe or Asia, the U.S. mainland wasn't devastated by the war.
That's a huge advantage. And they entered the war later too, right? End of 41.
Exactly, which meant its industrial base was intact and ready to ramp up, while others were already exhausted or destroyed.
And that sets the stage for the Cold War.
Yeah.
1947 to 91, decades defined by this U.S.-Soviet rivalry.
Yes, the Cold War era, characterized by this tense standoff. Relative peace between the superpowers, but only because of the nuclear threat. Mutually assured destruction.
And the U.S. strategy during this time?
Yeah.
Containment.
Containment, yeah. Largely inspired by George F. Kennan, the idea was to strategically block Soviet expansionism, contain communism wherever it threatened to spread.
But the conflicts during the Cold War, they were different, weren't they? Not like WWII or what came later.
Very different, often fought indirectly, through proxies. You saw a lot of half-victories, messy political compromises.
A state of neither peace nor war in many places.
Exactly. Very different from the idea of total victory you saw before or even later, like in the first Gulf War after the Cold War ended.
Well, the U.S. did manage some critical moments successfully.
Oh, yes. Think about the Berlin airlift or the Cuban Missile Crisis. Moments of very high tension, successfully navigated, showed real global leadership, albeit under duress.
It wasn't all smooth sailing, though. I seem to remember a period, late 70s maybe, where the U.S. seemed less dominant. Soviet influence seemed to be growing.
That's a fair point. Roughly 75 to 80, U.S. foreign policy did seem less dynamic. You had the fall of Saigon, increased Soviet sway in places like Angola, Ethiopia, the Iranian Revolution, the Sandinistas in Nicaragua, and then the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan in '79.
Yeah, that all painted a picture of shifting tides, maybe.
It certainly fueled that perception, yes.
So we've gone from expansion to Asia-Pacific engagement to superpower rivalry. What happens when that rivalry suddenly ends? The collapse of the Soviet Union changes everything again. What about Europe in all this?
Well, the old European order, dominant for centuries, really started to crack with World War I.
1914.
Yeah, and then after World War II, Europe's global dominance really declined.
Yeah.
Destruction, the rise of nuclear weapons changing the game, and of course the U.S. and Soviet Union emerging as a new big players.
And the U.S. had a direct hand in shaping that post-war European reality.
Absolutely. By intervening decisively in both world wars, the U.S. basically prevented any single hostile power from dominating Europe. That was key to the eventual post-war balance.
After the Cold War, everyone's asking, okay, who's the next adversary? And Samuel Huntington's Clash of Civilizations idea got a lot of airtime.
It did. Huntington's theory, from '94, I think, suggested future conflicts would be along these broad civilizational lines. He specifically pointed to potential clashes between the West and what he called Islam-Confucian civilizations.
But that theory was controversial.
Very. Critics argued it was way too simplistic. It kind of papered over all the diversity within these supposed civilizations.
Right, like conflicts within the Muslim world itself or historical rivalries in East Asia.
Exactly. Missed a lot of nuance, ignored economic factors, political realities.
So if not Huntington's clash idea, what was a more, maybe, grounded geopolitical take on the post-Cold War world?
Zbigniew Brzezinski offered a really influential analysis. He focused less on civilizations and more on the enduring importance of Eurasia.
Eurasia, the giant landmass.
Yeah. His argument, echoing some earlier geopolitical thinkers, even figures like Hitler and Stalin in their own way, was that controlling or heavily influencing Eurasia is the key to global power.
And which parts of Eurasia did Brzezinski see as most critical for the U.S.?
He highlighted a few key areas. Ukraine was vital. absolutely essential to prevent Russia from easily rebuilding a Eurasian empire.
Makes sense.
Azerbaijan was crucial, too, for its location and its role in getting oil and gas out of the Caspian region.
Energy politics.
Big time. And Central Asia generally for accessing those resources without having to rely solely on Russian pipelines. Uzbekistan also stood out as a key regional player.
So the U.S., sitting outside Eurasia, needs to actively play a balancing game within Eurasia.
That was Brzezinski's core argument. The U.S. needed to use all its tools, military, economic, technological, cultural, to be a strategic balancer, prevent any single power from dominating that crucial landmass and challenging U.S. global leadership.
Which brings us to that moment after the Soviet collapse. U.S. supremacy seemed total, unprecedented.
It really was unprecedented. The U.S. was the sole superpower left standing. Nothing quite like it before in terms of global reach, the sheer scope of its influence.
What made that power possible?
A combination of things. Superior organization, unmatched ability to mobilize resources, economic, military, technological, plus the cultural appeal, the soft power aspect, and dynamic elites.
How does it compare to older empires like Rome or China? Are there lessons there?
Well, comparisons are tricky but instructive. Rome faced overextension, internal strife, economic problems, potential pitfalls for any great power. China historically relied on cultural centrality but also had periods of decline, a key difference now. While countries like Russia and China might resent U.S. dominance, they don't currently have the across-the-board power to truly challenge the U.S. globally. Not yet, anyway.
And you mentioned soft power. That's a huge part of it, isn't it? Beyond just military bases and GDP.
Absolutely crucial. Think about English being the dominant language online, U.S. tech companies, universities attracting global talent, the appeal of democratic ideas, free enterprise. Even if the limits of the welfare state are becoming clearer, it all adds up.
And lobbying plays a role, too, in shaping policy.
Oh, definitely. Domestic interests and lobbying have a significant impact on foreign policy decisions.
So this U.S.-led liberal order, after WWII, it was built on American ideas, but it wasn't totally rigid. Allies had some room to maneuver.
Generally, yes. It reflected American principles, but allowed allies a degree of autonomy within that framework. It needed their buy-in. Now, back to Brzezinski's Eurasian chessboard.
Okay, yeah. The Central Zone, the South, the East. What happens if the U.S. and its allies lose their grip on these key areas?
Well, if a major rival dominated the center, especially if they also controlled the South or allied strongly with the East, that would fundamentally undermine the U.S. position. Similarly, if the major powers in the East united against U.S. interests, or if key allies on the western edge, like in Europe, drifted away and aligned with the central power, that would signal a massive shift, potentially isolating the U.S.
So maintaining influence across that chessboard is vital. But you also mentioned a constraint. America is too democratic at home to be autocratic abroad. How does that limit things?
It's a fundamental tension. Democracies historically haven't sustained that kind of global dominance for long. Power politics for its own sake doesn't usually sit well with the public unless there's a clear threat to their own well-being.
The costs are high money. Lives.
Exactly. Hard to justify those costs long-term without a compelling reason that resonates domestically. Democratic values clash with purely imperial ambitions.
And wasn't there a big debate inside the U.S. after the Cold War about what its role should even be?
Oh, yes. A major ongoing debate. Broadly, you have one camp arguing for less international engagement, focusing inward, regardless of the impact on global standing.
Pullback.
Right. And the other camp argues for continued active engagement, often through alliances and international institutions, even if it means compromising sometimes. Both views have strong support.
It sounds incredibly complex. Older geopolitical ideas talked about heartlands and sea power.
Yeah.
How does the modern thinking build on that?
Those older ideas, like Mackinder's Eurasian heartland being the key pivot, they're still influential precursors, but modern thinking is more nuanced.
How so?
It recognizes Eurasia's centrality, yes. But U.S. dominance isn't about physically controlling that heartland. It's about projecting influence onto Eurasia's key peripheries, west, south, east, and from there, influencing the interior. But Eurasia remains the only place big enough and potentially powerful enough to spawn a true rival.
Okay, so given that, what are the absolute must-dos, the core geostrategic imperatives for the U.S. and Eurasia?
You can boil it down to maybe three things. First, prevent rivals from ganging up no hostile collusion among major Eurasian powers.
Makes sense.
Second, keep allies dependent and cooperative, maintain the security relationships that give the U.S. influence. And third, prevent hostile alliances forming among other, maybe less predictable states on the periphery. Don't let the barbarians team up, metaphorically speaking.
And within Eurasia, you mentioned specific states being extra important, not necessarily the biggest, but strategically located. Geopolitical pivots.
Exactly. These pivots matter because of where they are. Their location might control energy routes, access to regions, or act as buffers between big players. They're often vulnerable, making them key points of focus.
Who are the key players and pivots we should be watching?
Well, the big geostrategic actors, the ones with real regional clout and ambition, are arguably France, Germany, Russia, China, and India.
Okay.
And then the critical pivots, states crucial due to location, include Ukraine, definitely,
Yeah.
Azerbaijan for energy, Korea in Northeast Asia, Turkey, bridging Europe and Asia, and Iran in the Persian Gulf Central Asia region. Turkey and Iran kind of blur the lines, having some actor characteristics too.
Let's zoom in on Russia for a second.
Yeah.
Even weakened after the Soviet collapse, it's still a major factor.
Huge factor. Its sheer size, its history, its nuclear arsenal, it looms large over its newly independent neighbors. And its fundamental orientation partner or adversary to the West is still one of the biggest questions in Eurasia.
And Ukraine's independence is central to that question, isn't it?
Absolutely fundamental. Brzezinski argued, and many agree, that without Ukraine, Russia simply cannot be a traditional Eurasian empire again. Regaining control over Ukraine, its people, resources, Black Sea access, would be the cornerstone of any attempt by Moscow to rebuild that kind of dominance.
What about Azerbaijan's role? Why is it so pivotal?
It's the cork in the bottle for Caspian and Central Asian energy heading west without going through Russia. An independent Azerbaijan with westward pipelines breaks Russia's potential monopoly on transit routes. If Azerbaijan falls under Moscow's sway, Central Asia becomes much more dependent on Russia, and Western access is constrained.
In Turkey and Iran, also pivots.
Yeah, both are incredibly important, though complex. Turkey anchors NATO's southern flank, controls the Bosphorus, balances Russia and the Caucasus, and offers a secular model in the region. Instability there would be disastrous. Iran, despite its challenges with the U.S., is a major player influencing Central Asia and the Persian Gulf and prevents total Russian dominance there.
So the U.S. is juggling all these actors and pivots. What are the biggest dilemmas, the toughest choices facing U.S. policymakers in Eurasia?
There are several huge ones. What kind of united Europe does the U.S. want, and how does it get there? What's the long-term role for Russia? How do you maintain stability in the volatile Eurasian Balkans, that whole arc from Southeast Europe through Central Asia? How do you manage China's rise? And what's the future of the U.S.-Japan alliance? They're all interconnected.
Let's touch on Europe. France sometimes wants more independence. Germany's role is growing.
Yeah.
How does that fit with U.S. goals?
Well, yeah, France often pushes for more European strategic autonomy, sometimes creating friction within NATO. Germany is deeply committed to the transatlantic link, but is also stepping up as Europe's leader. The U.S. generally wants a strong, unified Europe as a partner.
A bridgehead.
Exactly. A stable bridgehead on the western end of Eurasia that can help project stability and democracy eastward. That's why NATO and EU expansion have generally been supported by the U.S. to consolidate that democratic space.
Halting that expansion could send the wrong signal to Russia.
That's the concern. It might be seen as conceding a sphere of influence and could embolden Russian ambitions in Eastern Europe.
The Soviet collapse wasn't just geopolitical, it hit Russia hard internally too.
Profoundly. Economically disastrous initially. Health crises, environmental problems, a real psychological shock, the loss of empire. And losing Ukraine, as we said, fundamentally changed its strategic options, maybe pushing it more towards an Asian focus over time.
And the new Central Asian states, they're finding their feet too.
Very much so. Asserting their own national identities, often Islamic identities too. Controlling their own resources, which are considerable, and actively looking for partners beyond Russia, Turkey, Iran, Pakistan, China, the West to balance things out. Uzbekistan especially has resisted Russian dominance.
And all this is happening while China is rising rapidly in the east.
Exactly. East Asia has seen incredible economic growth, but also rising nationalism, military buildups, key shifts. China's ascent, Japan becoming maybe even more crucial for U.S. security strategy there, but also wanting a bigger political role itself. Russia's influence declining in the Far East, and the uncertainty around Korea.
China's view of itself seems deeply rooted in history. the Middle Kingdom idea of past humiliations.
Very much so. There's a powerful narrative of restoring China's rightful place, overcoming past grievances against Western powers, Japan, Russia. Achieving national unity, which includes Taiwan, is paramount. There's still suspicion about U.S. and Japanese intentions potentially trying to contain China.
But China faces its own hurdles, too.
Oh, definitely. Can it sustain the growth? Energy security, food security, environmental costs, internal inequality. And the big one. How does the Communist Party manage a dynamic, increasingly complex capitalist economy and society? Political liberalization seems inevitable eventually, but how and when is a huge question. Fragmentation is less likely now, perhaps, but internal tensions are real. And even with growth, it's still relatively poor per capita.
So maybe not a global superpower soon, but definitely the dominant regional power in East Asia.
That seems the likely trajectory for the near to medium term, yes. Its core goals appear to be internal development and regional sway, avoiding major conflict if possible. Tactical alignment with Russia against U.S. hegemonism makes sense for them, but a deep long-term alliance seems unlikely given their own interests.
And Japan, also changing. Younger generations feel differently about the past, want a bigger role.
Yeah, there's a definite shift. Less focus on WWII guilt, more desire for Japan to be a normal country with influence matching its economic weight, but it's still constrained by its U.S. security dependence and regional sensitivities. There's a huge internal debate about its future role.
What are the main viewpoints within Japan?
You've got staunch pro-Americans who see the alliance as vital. You have global mercantilists focused on economic interests. Dynamic realists want a more assertive role but carefully managed. And internationalist visionaries see Japan leading on global issues like peace and development. But they all generally want more recognition without wrecking the U.S. alliance or scaring the neighbors.
Okay, so wrapping this up. The world is changing. U.S. power isn't absolute or permanent. What's the overarching strategy needed for the U.S. in Eurasia now?
It needs to acknowledge the unique situation, sole global power, non-Eurasian, dominating Eurasia, but also recognize that won't last forever. Eurasia is just too big, too dynamic. So the strategy has to be selective. Deploy resources smartly, manage the rise of others, prevent a peer competitor.
Short-term and long-term goals.
Short-term. Don't get pushed out. Prevent any hostile power or coalition from dominating Eurasia or kicking the U.S. out of its arbiter role. Medium-term. Build real strategic partnerships. A unified Europe, a regionally strong but globally cooperative China, a post-imperial Russia looking west, a democratic India stabilizing the south.
And relations with Europe and China are key to influencing Russia's path.
Critically important, yes. And continuing NATO-EU enlargement helps consolidate democracy, which has always been a core part of the U.S.-Europe link. Stopping it could backfire. Russia's future depends on its own choices, but consolidating pluralism in Eurasia is a hedge against a return to Russian imperialism. Supporting the independence of former Soviet states like Ukraine, Azerbaijan, Uzbekistan is part of that hedge.
What about challenges to U.S. power from within or changing global economics?
Yeah, the U.S. share of global GDP will likely decline. No single nation might achieve that 20th century U.S. dominance again. Without a clear enemy like the Soviets, maintaining domestic support for costly global engagement gets harder. People might prefer focusing inward, or maybe push for more multilateralism, cultural shifts, aversion to casualties. These also play a role, and WMD proliferation makes intervention riskier.
So the window for unchallenged U.S. dominance might be closing?
It could be relatively short, historically speaking, which means the U.S. needs a smart, sustainable strategy for stability, maybe leveraging global networks, internet, NGOs, corporations for more cooperative internationalism. It needs effective management at home and abroad, and maybe a renewed sense of purpose.
This has been incredibly thorough. We've covered so much ground, from the early republic to the complexities of post-Cold War Eurasia.
It's a huge sweep of history, tracing how the U.S. got here, with Eurasia always being the central geopolitical stage.
And we find ourselves now at this pivotal moment, with huge opportunities, but also real challenges for the U.S. in a world that's definitely becoming more multipolar. For you, our listener, hopefully understanding these dynamics gives you a better lens for looking at current events and what might come next.
Exactly. It's about having that deeper context for the headlines.
So a final thought to leave you with. Considering everything we've discussed, the shifting power balances, the constraints, the importance of Eurasia, what do you think is the single biggest long-term challenge facing the U.S. in maintaining its influence? And what strategies might actually work best? Something to chew on. Thanks for joining us for this deep dive.